Thank you, everyone, for coming. I think if I was going to describe this last 7 years and put a title on that speech that the governor is using as a swan song, I would describe it as the decade of missed opportunities. History will judge us by our actions, not our words. While the governor was bending over backwards to pat himself on the back, we've lived through the past 7 years, and we know what's really happening in our state. We've seen a whole city be poisoned by lead-contaminated water. 2 years ago, Governor Snyder promised that he would dedicate the remainder of his term to restoring Flint. He has still failed to gain trust in my city, and there's still a lot of work to do. In the classrooms, we've seen Michigan kids fall further and further behind. We used to be leaders in education, but now we're shortchanging our kids and expecting teachers to do more with less. Every day we see crumbling roads on our way to work. They've talked about this magical roads plan, but the reality is that our roads are going to be even worse in 10 years. Let me say that again, even worse in 10 years. The fixes are going to cost more, and you're still going to be paying more in taxes and in registration fees. We've seen the profits before people philosophy bring us one crisis after the next, like thousands being wrongly accused of unemployment fraud and abuse at the Grand Rapids Veterans Home. And the list goes on and on. We've done a lot of work in this legislature to bring jobs back to Michigan, but that work isn't worth anything if we don't have folks ready to fill those jobs. We need to seriously commit to making sure people have access to the education and training necessary to be good candidates for these jobs. We also have to attract and retain talent. And one of the ways we can do that is by protecting prevailing wage. Here's what we know. Bottom line, governing has failed. The governor's balance sheet approach has been more important than poisoned kids in my community, more important than safe roads and bridges, and more important than even a meaningful tax break. How can we expect a brighter tomorrow if we have toxic drinking water? If we cut corners on educating our children, allow roads to crumble and fail to promise good-paying jobs. The Republicans love to refer to the previous decade as the lost decade. Well, I think we can all refer to this decade as the decade of missed opportunities. And the only way forward is to rebuild. The next decade, together, will be the decade of rebuilding. We will rebuild our roads, bridges, and water infrastructure. We will rebuild our educational systems, both in the skilled trades and the college prep programs. It's time for Michigan to be the best again. And we're only going to get there if we start putting people first. Now I'll turn it over to Leader Singh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Ananek, and I appreciate my colleagues from both the House and Senate being with us tonight. You know, what I found during the speech was that there was a disconnect between the Michigan that the governor was speaking of and the Michigan that people feel. I think many of you saw a poll that came out today, I think it was by the Detroit News, that said that 60% of Michiganders don't feel that the economy has gotten better under this governor, or it's worse. 60% of our state doesn't feel that the economy has worked for them, and it hasn't worked under the governor's leadership over the last 7 years. So where is that disconnect? We heard a lot of platitudes about what has happened under the legislature on the Republican side, but when 60% of your public doesn't feel like the economy is working for them, that they haven't seen that success, that their young people haven't seen the success in their schools, that they haven't been able to afford college, there is something wrong. And so I hope that as we take this last year of the governor, that we are willing to work across the aisle with Republicans, Democrats, Independents, to make sure that these areas that haven't been addressed over the last 7 years get addressed. And if they won't do it this year, then we'll make sure that in November of 2018 that we change the leadership here in Lansing, so somebody who will actually get those things done. Senator Ananek talked about some of those items. Right last week, we had business leaders and education leaders come up with an education report that showed that we're underfunding all of our schools by $2,000 per pupil. That's not just in urban communities, that's in rural communities, that's in suburban communities, that's every school district across the state. That wasn't even addressed during tonight. We did not hear from him about the $4 billion that his own infrastructure task force said needs to be invested on an annual basis to make sure that our roads are fixed, to make sure our bridges are safe, to make sure that our water systems are safe. Where was that conversation? And then obviously one of the things that I was most disappointed in was not hearing about how he was going to fix the final pieces of the unemployment agency crisis. This was his last time to speak to the public about how to fix the issues that his administration created in Flint or at the Grand Rapids Veterans Home, but also the people that his administration wrongly accused of a crime. How do we make all of those people whole? And last December, Democrats were pushing to make sure that money was available to make sure every single one of those people was fully kept whole in this process. And that did not happen last month. And so we call again on our Republican legislators and the governor to make sure that we fix that situation. And so if we are to be successful as a state, if those 60% of Michiganders can get the things that they need, we have to focus on jobs, we have to focus on education and the reinvestment in our infrastructure. And that's what we'll spend the next year talking about. And they can either join us or make sure that they're no longer here in the city of Lansing at the state capitol. So I think at this point in time, we'll open it up for questions from the media.
Mr. Singh, you've been outspoken about MSU and how they've been handling the scandal surrounding Larry Nassar. What do you think needs to happen next?
You know, it's obviously a very unfortunate situation of what's happening at Michigan State University. I want to, thank the brave women that have come forward to tell their story. It was obviously a tough week for those of us that were watching that testimony and to hear the horrific crimes that were committed. But I am so impressed with their bravery and strength to be able to talk about this. I'm an alum of Michigan State University. I've represented it for over 17 years, whether in the legislature or on the city council. And I have to say that I'm disappointed in all levels of the leadership at Michigan State University. I did call for the resignation of President Simon. I've also called for resignations of members of the Board of Trustees because I don't believe that they are handling the situation appropriately. One of the things that they did last week, finally, after a year plus of push from legislators and many people in the public, was to ask for an actual independent investigation. And whether that's the Attorney General, the U.S. Attorney, I want somebody to go in there and tell us exactly what happened. But I also want to thank you and the media for continuing to do the work that was necessary to find out additional items that were not necessarily brought forward by the administration or by the Board of Trustees. I do think that this is a moment in time where we can take leadership as a state. I've been talking to the Speaker. I know Senator Ananek and others that we have a role in the legislature to do oversight on this. And I hope that we do that in an effective way to be able to help us make sure that something like this never happens again, but also hold people accountable in the administration at the university.
What do you make of the talk about fiscal responsibility in a legislature with Republicans itching for tax cuts?
Well, you know, one of the things that we have to deal with is a crisis that was created by the recklessness of Washington, D.C. By Congress and those Republicans in Congress and President Trump. They've passed a tax plan that actually raises the taxes on Michigan citizens to fund tax cuts to corporations and millionaires and billionaires. And so that is something we're going to have to address as a legislature. We are pleased to talk about the personal exemption because we do believe the personal exemption is the most fair way to talk about dealing with the recklessness of Washington, D.C. But again, we wouldn't be in this situation if it wasn't for the recklessness of the congressional members, the Republican congressional members, and the President of the United States. So we will work across the aisle to be able to make sure that this tax hike doesn't happen to the hard-working families in our state. And we will see how that conversation goes forward. I do think that we have to make sure that we are funding key things. You know, there is a surplus in our school aid fund, and for us to be able to fund things in our K through 12 systems, we need that money. And so I would hope that the governor is correct when he says that he's going to be asking for a high amount into the per pupil funding, but we have to make sure that the Republicans in the legislature don't rob that money like they have for the last 7 years to put it into other areas. It needs to go into our K through 12 schools.
Do you think the personal exemption plans in the House and Senate right now, do those go too far? Should it be closer to the governor's original proposal so it doesn't cost as much?
You know, I think that's an important question. I think the problem is, as Leader Singh said, we know that the Republican reckless plan out of Washington, the congressional Republicans in the state voted for, raised our taxes by $1.5 billion if we didn't do something. We've seen over the last 8 years where corporations have had every tax break they've asked for and then some, where individuals are paying a much larger burden of the taxes in our state. I think a lot of us here, most of us here, believe that if we're going to provide tax relief, it's about time that families in Michigan, whether it's the child care tax issues or these other issues that help make sure that puts money back in the pockets of hardworking people. They've fallen farther and farther behind. We have to be responsible and make sure we invest. And I can tell you everyone up here and everyone in our caucuses will fight tooth and nail if the Republicans in the legislature try to siphon off money out of the school aid fund to fix the holes they've created in the budget. It's not fiscally responsible to look forward, and you've dedicated hundreds of millions of dollars for roads that you can't pay for, hundreds of millions of dollars for PPP reforms that you can't pay for. They've caused a problem, and now they're trying to look for people to blame. We know for sure Congressional Republicans and the Trump tax increase was going to cost Michigan $1.5 billion. We're doing the best we can to make sure that families in Michigan aren't burdened by those tax increases.
You talked about creating a fund to help the victims of the UIA fraud problem. How do you decide what expenses you would reimburse, and how big of a fund does that need to be?
Well, listen, that's part of the conversation that we need to have. We think it's probably somewhere in the range of $40 to $50 million. That is the starting point of the conversation. There might be a point in 6 months that we need to have more resources, and if we need more resources, we go back to that. We do believe having an outside mediator come in, not somebody from the governor's office, not somebody who caused the crisis, but bring an outside mediator who can take a look at what the expenses were that these families incurred. Many of them had to hire attorneys, many of them went into bankruptcy, and so there are people that are expert at this on the outside. We should bring them in, and they should be able to take a look at all the expenses that somebody incurred to fight these wrongful allegations. And we do think that type of system can be something that is created. We do think that there is support in the legislature in both chambers if it's given an opportunity for a vote. And if we don't do that, then shame on this governor and shame on the Republicans in the legislature for allowing a computer system that they said was going to solve a problem, which they actually then let people go from that department, and that caused this problem to, 40,000 some people. And so for us, we have to fix that, and the governor needs to fix that in the next few months. It should be resolved before we go away for our spring break recess.
Got time for one more question?
Talked a little bit about underfunding Michigan schools. Yet the governor did talk about having the biggest per pupil funding increase in the past 15 years. Is that a step that he's moving in the right direction on that issue?
Well, we welcome additional dollars and resources. We've been demanding that for years. What I hope happens over this next year is that the business community that was part of this report really talks about the fact that our test scores have gone down over the 7 years. If you take a look at how everybody was hopeful that this Amazon headquarters would come here, and one of the key areas that they said was lack of education. When you take a look at all those areas, it's key to understand that every metric, you talk to a superintendent, you talk to teachers, I know many of us brought people to the state that represent those areas. They will tell you that they don't have the resources, the classroom sizes are just way too big, that we're over-testing our young people. And so I'm hopeful that this report, which is hopefully a very telling document, opens eyes of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, that this governor has one more budget to fix some of the mistakes that he's made, and that we will work with him if he's willing to put more money into the schools and begin that process. But we do have to see a change in the culture of Lansing and the legislature, because we should be investing in those kids. We should be investing in those schools. When you take a look at all those other states that are investing higher levels of amount, they have better test scores. They have higher college education attainment. And that's one of the areas that we're really struggling in. So we'll work with anybody to solve those problems, make sure we have lower classroom sizes and we have more resources going into the schools. But again, it's a 7-year problem that was created by this administration.
Without question, it's, we know it's a step in the right direction. But one of the things I find most ironic, and I think a lot of my colleagues would, especially those who were in a classroom before they came here, for the governor in his last State of the State to mention an A through F system, when if you took that A through F system and put it on the Republicans in the legislature and the governor, I mean, as a teacher, I know Darren was a teacher, I don't know if I'd give them an F. I know I'd send a note home saying, I need to speak to their parents, because they've completely failed our children, and our educational system is getting worse and worse and worse. And that's something that Michigan should not accept, families across the state should not accept. And, you know, we'll work with anyone to make sure we put more resources in the classroom, we make sure more kids have an opportunity to have a career tech trade or college attainment. But we have a long ways to go. And, you know, we'll if they want to meet us where we're at, we're more than happy to let them join us.